Hi there, everybody, and welcome to our next session here at AOP Mastermind Live 2022. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I do want to give just a little bit of a disclaimer right at the top. If you see my Wi-Fi not be the best quality in terms of video every now and then, we had Hurricane Ian come through Orlando here last week. So I think that that's still having some impact on our infrastructure. But so far, so good. We've held up through the event, but I just wanted to share that before we started. So our session today, a session I've really been looking forward to. It's called Unlocking the X Factor in Procurement Transformation. So what is the X Factor in procurement? Is it our processes? Is it our people? Is it our technology? Or is it a combination of all three? And why do we even need an X Factor to begin with? So we're going to be exploring this and in the context of how do we really elevate our impact, as we've talked about for this entire event, 10x the impact that we can deliver for our businesses. So we're joined today in this session by three guests. I want to welcome them onto the stage with me. First of all is Radhika Samant, the VP of Finance and Head of Global Procurement at Optimizely. Iovance Head of Procurement, Andy Shigo, and Lalitha Rajagopalan, the co-founder and Head of Strategy and Marketing at Oro. So Lalitha, Andy, Radhika, welcome to today's session.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
Thanks, Phil.
Now, I'm going to kick things off by just kind of asking a question of each one of you, just for some context as we go into the conversation. Andy, first of all, I'm going to come over to you. You're a very experienced procurement practitioner. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about your role at Iovance.
Yeah, so Iovance is a biotech firm and small to medium-sized company, and I head up procurement, and I'm building the procurement organization. So this is a little different from my previous roles where I was in very large procurement organizations within Merck and Roche for over 30 years. And so here it's really building processes, engaging the stakeholders proactively, trying to get control of the spend, and do all that simultaneously.
You have the opportunity of having a somewhat of a blank canvas, I think, to start building your approach to procurement from.
Yeah, and so for us, it's really understanding, taking all those different experiences that I've had and what worked and what did not, and try to break through and say, what do we want to do right first time around stakeholder engagement, make it easy to use procurement. And so it's really a blank canvas, to your point, Philip, and we're using some very interesting technology around how do we want to engage the requesters right up front.
Mm-hmm. Radhika, we talked before as we did preparation for this session, you were talking a lot about your experience as a CFO. So I'm always interested when I talk to somebody who's come from outside of the procurement profession. What was your perspective of procurement? And, how has that then shaped your approach or looking to build a procurement function within, Optimizely?
So, just in the as an outsider, like in the fact that where I was a CFO, obviously procurement was kind of part of my role because we were, in setups or companies which were a lot more self-sufficient than having a completely independent procurement function. But having interacted a number of times or seen these kinds of organizations, there's always this perception that it's very stoogey. They're, not there to create value. They're really there to set up barriers and those kinds of things. So coming in as a CFO and being asked to lead this function was very exciting for me because I think spend in any company is a very big part of the spectrum, and it requires equal amount of attention as would revenue. And many times I think the procurement team can be a huge influencer of that. So actually I'm a fan of procurement done right. So very excited to have this opportunity at Optimizely to see that dream kind of come true.
And we could probably talk for the whole half an hour about turning procurement into a revenue driver versus just a cost manager. And I say just not to diminish that, but I think it's one of the holy grail for procurement is to position itself in a way that sales, marketing, and other areas of the business can position themselves as aligned to the top line versus the bottom line. So maybe we'll get into a couple of those things as we go through the conversation. Lalitha, I do want to bring you in as well. So you've got a lot of experience from a procurement technology perspective, spent a lot of years in the leadership team at Ariba before going out and co-founding your own organization called Oro. What was the gap in the market that you saw, or the opportunity, or the pain point that you saw, that you felt, you really wanted to divert all of your energies into solving?
Well, you know what they say, you can take a girl out of procurement, but only for so long. So I'm a certified procurement geek. I actually think it's a very interesting problem to solve. I think technology has done a lot to make things easy within an organization, but when it comes to between companies, between organizations, there's still a lot of friction to be solved. And what I felt was that, my journey at SAP Ariba, and even looking at all the procurement technologies, is that procurement from a technology perspective still remains a very transactive architecture, if you will, right? It's all centered around a requisition, a binary approval or no, and about spend management. And I feel that it has lost its relationship management angle in terms of what is it that human beings at each end of the spectrum are trying to do. And I felt that it's really important to be something that can be a change maker here. So can procurement actually get a seat at the table, be in the room where it happens, and can technology aid them in doing that? And that's why I was really excited to see architecturally, is it something that we can build from ground up? One example, my co-founders and I always say is like, look at Salesforce. They don't talk about, order to cash. They talk about leads and opportunities and value generation. So why can't procurement basically play a similar role on the other flip side of the coin?
So we framed the conversation at the beginning around the X factor for procurement. And Radhika, I'm going to ask you this first of all. What does this idea of an X factor in procurement mean for you?
So coming into Optimizely, and first of all, when I took over the procurement function, one of the challenges that I kind of faced was this perception that procurement is just there to create barriers and delay the process. And when I looked at some of the literature that had been put out or shared out, it was a lot about, the purchase order process. You can't get your invoice paid without a PO. And if you make procurement only about that, then, there is no X factor, because you lose speed, you lose control, you lose, compliance becomes the primary, right? So that doesn't work. Looking at reinventing this, I think the X factor for procurement needs to be centered around a few different things. One, the recognition that your customer is actually responsible for revenue generation in most cases, or product, both of which influence revenue, right? So speed is of essence to them. There is no choice. They need to move fast, and we need to be empathetic to that cause, and portray and partner with them to enable that. The control and compliance pieces need to be a result of. I mean, if it's done right, then that's what's required. And when I started to think through how I wanted to solve this problem at Optimizely, I think Lalitha mentioned the people, the human beings, right? Ultimately, it's pulling those human beings together into a common framework that you can look at together and make the same decisions. I'm very convinced that a set of intelligent people, given the same set of information, will probably come to the same conclusions. And it just takes away the friction, right? So one of the classic things with working with Oro for me, with Lalitha, is being everything that I wish and desire, it's like, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that, because they've thought about it in that fashion. Yeah. So it's that marrying of process and system and people at the center of it that I think drives that X factor. And that's how that collaboration can happen. You need to get to the same goals, and it will work out.
Andy, do you feel like we need an X factor as a procurement organization?
Yeah, from an X factor perspective, we looked at the three: people, process, and tools and systems, right? And we've done a lot around our people and our processes, but how do we use our systems to enable all three, right? And so working with Oro, we really just made it simple for people to engage procurement and do it in a way that's Amazon-like, right? So make it simple. People are used to buying off Amazon and other websites, and the purchasing systems we have today, even cloud-based, are not user-friendly, right? You still have to have training. You still have to think through all those different checkpoints. You have to think about what commodity codes you want. And with Oro, what we've done is make a simple entry form that comes into procurement to review. And if it's simple, it just goes right through into our purchasing system. If it's something we want to get ahead of, we work with the stakeholders proactively and give them what they need. And so making it simple to check for regulatory compliance and legal, and also the interactions with our suppliers. So, from our perspective, putting the suppliers, the stakeholders, and procurement together electronically allows us upfront to make those decisions, select the right supplier, onboard them efficiently and effectively, have those compliance checks that are important, right? Doesn't feel overburdensome. And then we go right into our procurement system. So that X factor to me truly is technology.
Now, we have a question. Radhika, I'm going to come to you with that question in a minute, but I do want to come to Lalitha because we talked a lot about the people, process, technology and where the procurement X factor is amongst those. You've obviously spent a lot of time around technology. How do you bring, or what's your experience of bringing together all those three? Or is there one that's more important than the other? Or kind of, how do we balance it so we're not just focusing on one specific thing?
I think there are, I like to frame this as like a necessary condition and a sufficient condition, right? I think the necessary condition is the will of the people, or culturally is an organization ready to basically hand the baton back to employees. And I think we are at a tipping point where we are seeing that it's no longer a command and control, centralized kind of a process. Businesses, because they need to move fast, have given a lot of agency to employees to make business decisions. Okay, so that I think we're at a tipping point from people's mindset and being able to take responsibility and be a self-driving process. The process itself, the one thing that I will say is that this is probably the hardest thing, because the reality, what we see with the SaaS explosion and everything, right? Not even a small organization will be a single tool to do them all, right? You cannot have a single procurement tool to rule them all kind of a thing. So you are going to have end-to-end process, a start-to-finish process that makes sense for all of the stakeholders in the process. You can't be the legal is in the legal system and then that part becomes a black box. So visibility for people to be able to work and collaborate together is something that's really necessary for the process to work. And that's where technology comes in. And I feel that technology has to enable self-governance, and the visibility and the user experience is not enough just for the intake part or the requester or the supplier experience. It's not as if legal or data privacy is kind of like, just twiddling their thumb and being meanie pigs. They are trying to do their job, if you will. So I think it's really important for technology to be an enabler for activating the end-to-end ease of use and efficiency.
Yeah, we've definitely talked a lot today throughout our different sessions around how do we think about the stakeholder experience and how do we help to devolve responsibility for certain elements back into the business, or create transparency so that stakeholders, so that procurement isn't a black box. Because ultimately we've spent so long of procurement just being this black box where people don't really know what's happening, they don't know where to go for answers, and that causes a lot of frustration. Now, we talked in this session a couple of times around compliance. And so this is where one of the questions that came in, I'm going to ask this because it was asked specifically to you, Radhika. Given your point of view on control and compliance, how do you measure the success of your procurement team?
I measure the success of my procurement team not by control and compliance, because I think that should be an output of the system itself and the process that we follow. So the success of the procurement team is on how quickly were they able to get the deals done, how much value did they add to negotiation, did they start with a where did we start, where did we end, how did they partner with the business, and is the business actually reaching out to procurement proactively, to my procurement team, to partner with them and ask them and inviting them into the deals. The control and compliance piece of it, if done right, I really believe it's just creating visibility. It's making sure that there is a place where all of the contracts and details are available. It's allowing access to the compliance team and to the legal teams to do their job, and making sure that all of those factors are taken in. And from a CFO angle, the most important piece is pulling together all of that contract and obligation data, and having it accessible and available for any kind of a fundraise process, sale process, whatever may happen in a company lifecycle. So that's my lens, in all honesty. I'd be curious to know what Andy feels, how much is procurement responsible for control and compliance?
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, compliance needs to happen, and it has to happen in parallel. and should be done automatically as much as possible and automate the process, and also visible. So with technology and what we're using with Oro, people can see what the compliance checks are and how we automate them and what the status is. And so, by making it visible, it's there. And what we said is, if you come in and you engage procurement proactively with the tool, you're going to be 100% compliant. So make it easy for them, right? So I think that's kind of my compliance check from a procurement perspective. And, from a value generation, it's really, Radhika, as you said, if the business is engaging us proactively and really seeks out procurement support, and, it's something I said, the other day, I said, when you look at an org chart today, most organizations, you have HR and you have finance as global functions sitting on any org chart. I said, where is procurement on that org chart? Because if you are, you're truly a valued business partner, and they're seeking your business insight, not just your procurement insight.
Now, I have another question that I think I know the answer to because we've already covered it, but it came in from the audience, so I'm going to ask it just to go around the table. Rather than speaking about compliance, should procurement talk about process in terms of how our stakeholders impact revenue and operations?
Philip, could I take that one, please, to lead? Because this is my passion project right now. I'm so excited with it that I just want to share this. When I started thinking about procurement, I really started about thinking about stakeholder impact, because one is shareholder impact, and then I'm going to move it down to stakeholder impact, actually, because ultimately there is a common goal that every business has, and that's to build value. And I think about value in influencers in three different components. One is revenue. Procurement directly impacts revenue growth because you enable the fastest possible way, and return on investment it's the other part of the equation in return on investment, right? The second portion is obviously efficiency and profitability. We impact that directly because obviously we negotiate the best possible deals and make sure that it's as efficient as possible. And the third is preservation of value. Now, this is not a topic that people think about too much, but preservation of value is all about making sure that risk, compliance, data availability, all of that is happening, right? So that to me is one thing that immediately ties our stakeholders and procurement together into a common goal, and that's really important. When you think about the stakeholder impact and revenue and operations, I actually think of procurement should be a mirror image of how revenue operations has come up. Revenue operations has become a driver, and it's a I remember a time when it didn't exist, but it's become like this major function now that actually enables sales and revenue. If you think about procurement, spend is the other side of that. You have to find the right vendors. You have to find the enablers to drive revenue on the spend side of it. So why not mirror the same organization? So I have my procurement team in two parts. One is the procurement piece of it, who are the people who are experts, many, many years, 35 years plus of experience in dealing with negotiations and handling contracts and selecting vendors in the best possible way. But the other side of this equation is procurement operations, which I like to refer to as spend operations. I really think every company needs a spend operations team that starts from the point at which a team member or some employee in the company feels the need to incur an expense. And then just build that visibility and take it all the way through the process of identifying the need. Are the right stakeholders okay? Do we agree this is a business need? Giving opportunity for people to interact by exception. That's what Oro enables for us. Take it all the way to authorized signatories to say, yeah, the purchase approval has occurred. You can sign this. And the PO should just be released because, at least in our world, unless it's a rate contract or it's an items goods PO, right? It should just be raised. So if you can enable spend operations to create visibility into spend, and enable procurement to drive that value that I talked about in terms of revenue, efficiency, and preservation, you suddenly have a function that should come into the limelight and should absolutely be a partner both to FP&A, all FP&A and accounting, as well as to business stakeholders. And really, that's what I'm trying to imagine and create at Optimize and I'm so grateful because from a system standpoint, I think coming across Oro and being able to say this and keep hearing, yeah, that's possible, has been like a game changer. So that I think the technology piece of it is definitely a driver in the X factor.
I do want to just come back and because I had a question that I want to dispel the myth that the only thing that a CFO cares about is cost savings, because I think that's what us as procurement, it's kind of beaten into us from the early days, is to demonstrate our value, we have to drive cost savings. It's like cost savings at all costs. You obviously talked there about revenue. You talked about efficiencies. You talked about preservation of value. How do you, what answer would you give to people who still think, hey, to demonstrate value to finance, it has to be all about savings?
I mean, if you think that the CFO only cares about expense, I mean, just think about the CFO's role, right? The CFO's role is to make sure that the value of the company is going up. The role is not to cut cost. If you're cutting cost and it's impacting execution, you suddenly just depleted the value of the organization.
Yeah.
So if you truly want to be a partner with your CFO, you have to imagine the fact that his interest is in optimizing or getting to the best possible value, obviously, and that's the ROI conversation, right? Yes, of course, you should negotiate your contracts to the best possible level, but you also need to build the relationship with the vendors. You can't be in a relationship with vendors that is contentious. You actually need proactive adoption. I mean, software is a huge part of our game, right? We need to purchase so much software. Marketing requires their events and agencies and all of those people to be really tied into them. So we can't be on a cost cutting mission. I think we have to get to fair value for both parties, of course, do our best possible to make sure we are getting fair value. And that is a critical part of the function. But the CFO really cares about everything else as well. Execution, is the software getting deployed, making sure we are taking out any spend in the business that's actually shelfware. There are so many different ways in the switch, in ways like for me right now, my whole plan is around, okay, I have now got access to all my renewals data. I want procurement to proactively start looking at those, not with the intention of, oh, can we renew it flat or less, but is it deployed in the business?
Yeah.
Let's make sure that we are partnering with them to see that, and make a strategy, come up with a plan. And that's how you change the value of what procurement can be. And you will be lockstep with the CFO, no question about it.
You're driving efficiencies through demand management, as opposed to just going and, making everybody's life more difficult by reducing cost. Andy, I've got a question for you. I'm going to come to you in one moment. I do want to ask Lalitha something just to build on what Radhika said, which was about managing through exception. We talked about compliance earlier. And I think one of the things that we get a bad reputation for in procurement is slowing down the process, is trying to manage compliance to everything as opposed to having just an exception process. Can you talk a little bit about how you think we should be thinking about managing by exception versus, trying to govern everything?
I think part of it is actually the way the legacy procurement technology was built and deployed, like circa 1990s technology, if you think about it, right? You had the CrowdJig matrix, so you had the standardized, items which procurement had, purchasing power to negotiate and put in a catalog or whatever, and everything else was wild west. And basically you kind of shoved that whole lot into, ad hoc spend request or non-catalog item or something like that. And architecturally, the systems were basically designed as an approval workflow, which was designed to say no if you don't, go on the main line, if you go, right? And I think that when you say manage by exception, a big part of being able to empower business users to do what they need to do, buy what they need to buy, engage with the suppliers they need to engage with, not for themselves, but because their job required it, right? A big part of it is actually context enablement, right? Can you make the context automatic and clear for all the stakeholders so that managing by exception is actually possible? And I think that's a big differentiator in terms of, can a software be not a naked software, which all it does is say yes, no to things if it doesn't meet the criteria, but can it be an intelligent workflow, a smart workflow, which brings context, which brings the data with the thing? I mean, we're working with Radhika, right? One of the most interesting things is like, hey, my team doesn't own the budget. The spend budget is owned by the department heads, but they lack visibility today before they make a commitment. So when they are trying to approve a spend, they lack visibility to what is the state of the union of their budget, right? What is the visibility? How much have you committed? How much have you already paid out? What's the demand signal that's coming down the pipeline? Now that is essentially managing by exception. Like, I'm not saying no because it's not compliant, but from financial control perspective, in these times, I really need to dial the knob more effectively in terms of how I want my budget to be used. And that's a decision you need to empower the teams. And with Andy, with R&D spend and everything, there's a lot of innovation related spend that goes on, but exception is the rule, if you will.
Yeah, and Andy, I want to come to you. Thank you, Lalitha. I know that we've only got a couple of minutes left here, and I do want to ask a question to Andy. So Andy, I'm going to pose this to you because, in an organization, we talked before around, one, the importance of technology for you in building your infrastructure around procurement. But two, in a relatively young organization, the challenge that a lot of folks in growth organizations have is stakeholders who say, well, the success, we got the company to where it is today by doing the things that we did on our own. Why do we even need procurement to come and get in the way? How do you think about the use of technology in changing the hearts and minds so that it actually is more of a no-brainer for your stakeholders to say, yeah, I want to embrace this, as opposed to kind of get out of my way because we've been okay so far?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is you're growing so fast. What we tell them is what you've done in the past was great, but it's not sustainable, right? It's not sustainable to have manual processes and do manual supplier checks and so forth, and have them enter in discussions and the systems manually within contracts or vendor ad. So by automating those processes, and we just call them procurement process, make it simple for that. It gives you much more time to have a discussion around how they manage their budgets. Like now it's budget planning, kind of sessions. And, how do we want to, act proactively? This is when you get your foot in the door. What problems they have, what are they trying to accomplish in their business objectives. So it allows the technology to take all that stuff that's, usually bogs procurement down and automates it, right? And make it easy to be compliant, all the things we talked about. And it gives you that headspace and builds that credibility of having those discussions to solve those business problems and speak business, right? So I'm not going in there talking about my sourcing process or, quite frankly, the details of all their spend, right? I'm going in there and saying, where do you have problems? Where do you want to go? What we're trying to do to, get approvals from their business. And it's different. It's different from having the discussion with commercial versus, finance and support groups like HR versus R&D. And so if you go in there and you have that tool, and that tool can help enable that, it just helps procurement really, we talk about that seat at the table or the seat at the org chart. It allows you to focus on what's important.
Yeah. And that's something we talk all about, is focusing on outcomes. Like, how are we driving outcomes of the business, as opposed to how are we looking at our own internal targets and goals. And, looking at the business as a way for us to achieve our goals, rather than looking at ourselves as a service provider within a business to help them achieve theirs. So I know it's time to wrap up. So I want to thank you, Andy, thank you, Lalitha, thank you, Radhika, for joining us for this session on really how to think about the X factor from a procurement perspective, and how do we drive an X factor for our stakeholders. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Right, and on to our next session. So if you stay here in the live feed, we're actually going to automatically forward you into the next session. That's going to be with Kelly Barner and Adam Brown, where they'll be rethinking the 80-20 to achieve the art of the possible. We'll be there starting that session in about 5 minutes' time. Thank you very much.